Junius Groves.
Junius Groves.
Junius Groves.
Junius Groves.
Junius Groves.
Junius Groves, the potato king of the world.
He's known as the Potato King.
The Potato King.
He arrived here in 1879 with only 90 cents.
90 cents.
90 cents in his pocket.
He had a lot of respect from both black and white.
He was determined
He was a hard-working man.
to support the community.
A successful farmer.
And nationally known.
Groves becomes a millionaire.
And a millionaire.
When Junius died, just 60 years old,
Heart disease
Heart attack.
the big mansion
22-room red brick mansion.
was destroyed in a fire.
starting an accidental fire.
We were told that it was arson. I'll just say that.
So here we're at Ophelia's Blue Vine Farm. This is my urban farm on 24th and Vine. Grandmother Ophelia, she was a phenomenal black woman. She was a seamstress by trade. Grew up on a family farm in Arkansas, over 100 years old. Around Christmas time, she would pull out collard greens from the freezer and they would just taste so delicious. That's really why I got into doing this urban farming thing. When I had kids, I wanted them to have that experience, and so really we just started it because I wanted them to know what I call real food tastes like, real tomatoes. When I came to Kansas City, I fell in love with Kansas City and all of its rich history as far as African Americans, as far as jazz. So I bought these lots back then, and they didn't have anything on them. They were just wooded. But then over 8 years, I was able to build up the infrastructure. I was working here inside Ophelia's, and there was a honk at the door, and I went out and I met Bob and Deborah Ford.
They interviewed him down at Vine. I told my wife, I said, look, I gotta meet this guy.
And they were so inspired with what I was doing. They came down, and Bob said, I'm farming, I'm getting out of the business, I'm gonna teach you everything you need to know.
I'm from Arkansas, I'm off a truck farm practice, where we pick cotton down there. But I came here when I was 12 years old. I started working the fields when I was like 15 years old. During the time of going into the military, I was ex-Marine. I did 22 years. I went to Vietnam twice. And then when I came back, I, started doing a little farming and stuff like that. And then I ended up buying some property out here, which where we own now. Just grows ground and take it over.
It's some good soil.
Yeah, you can't beat the sandy loam.
I was like, last year, you gave me the spiral okra, and I planted at the same time outside Ophelia's. You planted it here, and my plants, you came by, and you said, Mike, is it up? Is it up? I said, I think I don't see it. And then Ms. Ward came out and showed me. It was like, there's one. It was here.
You
and some of that okra never
even
got.
You planted thick because you could always thin it out.
But it just didn't do the soil. The dirt's not right.
We got the best in the world right here.
Tell me why you want to put that teapot. Who knew that Edwardsville, Kansas had some of the best soil, the sandy loam soil, and it's where a black millionaire who had come from slavery had found his freedom and built his empire.
I'm farming the same land as Junius Groves farmed back in the 1800s.
So Junius Groves was a man who figured out how to grow potatoes. He was highly successful, so much in fact that he was a #1 exporter of potatoes in the world.
The mission of the Black Archives of Mid-America is to collect, preserve, share, educate, and exhibit the life and culture and history of people of African descent in this region. Every one of the thousands of documents, artifacts, pictures that we have were donated to the Black Archives, which makes them extremely special to us because these are the artifacts that our community says are essential to identifying Black life and culture.
The most interesting thing about Junius Groves, he was an agricultural producer. Being an African American agricultural producer then was rare, and now it's rare. He was doing at his time what I'm just starting to get into now.
So come on in to the archives at the Black Archives. The Kansas Business Hall of Fame inducted Junius Groves 3 years ago now, and they gave us his plaque.
Junius Groves was born in 1858 or 59, depending on which source you look at. He was born an enslaved person in Kentucky.
We do know his father had enlisted in the Civil War and died of food poisoning.
After the Civil War, of course, he gained his freedom at the age of 6.
At that point, his mother remarried, so Junius did have an older brother, several brothers and sisters. He also had several stepbrothers.
And he lived with his mother and his siblings and stepfather until 1879.
The exodusters were African Americans who left the South in the late 1870s looking for a better life than what they were experiencing in the South and the really severe racism in the South. There were people that were promoting states like Kansas as places that you would be able to experience a kind of freedom that you could not experience in the South, and where you could get land through the Homestead Act to be able to make a better life for yourself and your family.
Around the age of 17 or so, Junius decided he would come to Kansas with the big Exoduster movement.
He walked 500 miles. Can you imagine walking 500 miles from Kentucky to Kansas?
When Junius Groves came here, he had 90 cents in his pocket.
He sharecropped with Farmer Williamson for a time.
He proved good enough that Williamson ended up making him the foreman and renting him like 6 acres of his own land and allowed him to use his equipment to farm that.
The railroad is changing a lot of things in America at this time, and by the early 1900s, in fact by 1900, Kansas City is larger than Los Angeles. It's one of the largest metropolitan areas west of the Mississippi River. The railroads make it possible for men like Groves to ship their products far away. And of course, by the early 20th century, he is shipping potatoes and probably other crops too, as far away as Mexico and Canada. He's really a continental businessman.
He experimented on his own with the cultivation of the potato crop, which was his principal crop. But he also had vineyards, sawmills, fruit trees, raised cabbage.
So he turned that patch of land into a money-making venture for him and for his family.
He marries a woman named Matilda from Missouri. She was only about 16 or 17 at the time, but they would go on to have 14 children, 12 of whom lived to adulthood. They were partners in every regard that we can see. In the interviews that he gave and all the sources where he's on the record, he talks about, we bought this land, we paid off that mortgage. He always says we, plural, to include her.
He bought a piece of land from a Native American lady. He gave her $1,400 cash and paid the rest, another $1,400, using the sharecropping method.
My name is Nina Kimbrough Johnson, and Junius Groves is my great uncle. I heard about Junius Groves when I was a young child, and then just growing up, I got more interested in him. My mother was working to be able to preserve some of the history. Many of his grandchildren have worked to preserve the history, and so it's been an ongoing thing where our family has tried to keep that history alive within the family.
You know, I've studied Kansas history and African American history and Western history for a long time, and it's only been the last few years when I started to see him as important for all of the things that I've studied. He lived during probably the worst time, racially speaking, that this country ever saw.
Many times we want to keep things in a positive light, but we have to really be aware of what the times were. These were the early 1900s, the late 1800s. And so there was tension. There were also some things that were not in the best light.
He lived during a time when segregation was becoming the norm, when lynching violence was at an all-time high, when all of the rights that African Americans had been given after the Civil War by the Reconstruction Amendments were being taken away. Anybody would feel depressed and debilitated, and yet it's during this time that Groves becomes a millionaire.
Our ancestors had it much harder than we have. We really don't have an excuse not to do it. Over 8 years ago, me and my sons started farming on different lots in Kansas City, and a lot of those we would rent. So we just grew produce on these different lots. We did what we could, where we were with what we had. We didn't know how the money was coming in, but we knew that if we just kept taking steps forward, did the right thing, had a belief in God that it would turn out for us, and it has.
Wyandotte County History Museum has been in existence since the 1950s. The collections of this museum are traditional collections. They have been donated to the museum and collected by museum staff.
A picture of Junius Groves holding the biggest cabbage I think I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, I mean, he was really the king of agriculture.
I love the fact that there was not just potatoes, but there was an orchard with many, many vegetables, many, many fruit trees, and that he made sure that others were able to also access land.
It says this photo shows Junius Groves and his cabbage factory employees. 1913, Groves founded the Grove Center, located at 98th and Call Drive.
Junius Groves played a real role in the development of that area. He created a town called Grove Center.
A regular little town from the sounds of it. There was a lot of families that were building homes there because Junius had sold them the property.
He took some of his land and allowed others to have their own land and have a house on that land.
Some of the things he did was to build a church.
Eventually, he would open a grocery store.
Golf courses, even though black people paid city taxes and county taxes, they were restricted from playing on the golf courses. So he opened up a golf course for black golfers.
He employed over 50 men and women, black and white.
And apparently the Union Pacific even had a special railroad hub near his property just for the loading of the tubers.
He did a lot of things to try to support the community, like creating a roller rink on his property so that young people would have wholesome things to do.
The church that we're sitting in today, he founded this church, Pleasant Hill Baptist Church.
He would have minor interest in banks, a casket company. He also would end up owning several hundreds of acres in western Kansas.
He was a man of the community, that he really wanted to make sure that the community, that his family, that the children had the things that they need, and he was a very giving man and sharing man.
Junius Groves was well regarded in his community and promoted his community and Negroes in business. He was part of the Kaw Valley Potato Growers Association and a couple of other business-related organizations.
He also had political connections. At times, was a delegate to state conventions.
And he built his empire to have 2 mansions, is that correct?
I understand there were 3 mansions. The one that's most mentioned in sources is the 22-room red brick mansion that sat up on the hill above the railroad tracks.
when he built his home, he made sure that he built things in the community that his children would be able to take advantage of. He had places in his home for them to enjoy and play. They could bowl. They had outside, of course, land. So he made sure that his community, that his family learned from him, and that they were able to also aspire to home ownership.
This is Junius in the Kansas City Star in 1910. The Negro does not get much encouragement in the cities. The Negroes ought to get out of the cities. The farm is the place for them. The race will go forward in the country, where its members are away from the evil influences of city life and the glamour and show. Before you deal with things like police harassment and poverty and lack of capital to develop urban areas, I think Junius would say at the very basic, you need to eat. And before we even have relationships with other people, need a relationship with nature. They need to know where tomatoes come from. They need to know different kinds of potatoes. They need to know the purity of their water. If you don't know where you are, then you don't know who you are. And I think Junius would be the first one to say that that lesson applies to African Americans just as much as it does to anybody else.
So we've come a long way in 2 months, and this was one of the first field that the watermelon started to produce for us, and they're still producing as we come out of the summer. And it's been a wonderful summer. Everything produced well. So this is what I'm looking for. The first tendril is good. Yellow field spot color. That's a good sign. It's a good sign. It's much tighter. Much tighter. This is what we want.
Junius Groves died in August of 1925. He did have a few health problems. Sources say he dealt with rheumatism, heart disease, and finally, most sources say he died of the heart disease and or a heart attack.
I believe part of that may have been just brought on by extreme stress and strain.
His funeral in August of 1925 in Edwardsville was the largest gathering that that town had seen up to that point.
They say that there were over 300 vehicles at the mansion. 11 ministers spoke.
His son, Walter Groves, gave a moving eulogy from what we're told. There was a strong presence of the Masons there at his funeral.
It is said there were 3,000 to 5,000 people.
Another banker from Commercial Bank said he is known as a man with exceptional ability, a keen insight, courteous manners, and good financial sense, a citizen of unquestionable character.
It was a tribute to the man in which they called him the greatest farmer that the race had ever produced.
So today we're going to Franklin Cemetery, and we're going to hopefully see where Junius Groves, the Potato King, is buried.
This is the cemetery that Junius bought part of. And this is supposedly where he's buried. Nobody knows the grave site 100%, or if they do, they're not telling there. But I speculate that he is right up here.
He did not want his grave marked at the time of his death. There was grave robbing going on. He was probably afraid that they would rob his grave.
The information that we have received is that everyone wasn't a fan of Junius Groves and the empire that he built. We were also told that when Junius G. Groves passed away, that there was a marker, a stone, and that stone was stolen. My mother says twice. I don't want to be blinded by the fact that everybody thinks that everything was roses for an African American gentleman who had that much wealth and that much property in the early 1900s.
And his wife died about a year after his death?
Yes.
Right. She had been in ill health. And I think she died of a broken heart.
Wow.
I think she really died of a broken heart there.
And when he dies in 1925, he has a will already in place in which he has already made decisions about where his estate is going to go and how it will be governed. He essentially gave the executors of his will unlimited power to decide how it would be distributed to his children.
It's my thought, knowing some of the history of Junius, he loved to sit on the porch and overlook the land and the property and the houses where his children and relatives lived. He always said he was doing it for them. Well, if you keep that in mind, this is the high ground. Where could he overlook everyone?
So this would be a perfect spot. And his land was over.
His land was that way, there. There's land along the road here and here that is still owned by the Groves family. But my thoughts are, this is probably where he is buried, in this area right here, because he could overlook everything.
Well, it just breaks my heart to see that he doesn't have a tombstone in all that he's done in his incredible success throughout the world and how he's inspired a generation of people.
A lot of people feel like he came from nothing. And one of the things, if I didn't say anything, I wanted to say that I believe he came from something. He came from a wonderful family, from a family who loved him and taught him and cared for him. He got a good sense of a work ethic and making sure that others were taken care of.
As Farmer Bob told me the story of Junius, and it was a beautiful story, and then right as we got to the ending, it just drops off, you know? And so part of my fascination was that just doesn't, there's something more there.
That's the really sad part of the story, is that when you have someone of great wealth, at that time, I think that everybody didn't necessarily like the wealth that he had. And I would ask my mother that often.
Yeah.
What happened to the land? What happened to the houses? What happened to his tombstone? The home that was burnt down in 1964 had not been lived in for about 18 months or so. But of course, he had passed away in the 1920s. And so that was not the first house that burned. And isn't it interesting that 3 houses burn? Isn't it interesting that all of them, no one ever knew what actually happened? We were told that the KKK, that it was arson. I'll just say that. Junius D. Groves was a man that loved his community and wanted to see others do better. Isn't that such a great example, a great inspiration to want to make sure that our families, our neighbors, our community is the best community that it could be? And my hope is that we continue to rise and to continue to share stories of wonderful Americans.